Okay, so you guys have sent in some really interesting stuff this time about Hollywood. And it's this idea that there are all these movies out there that are super successful, but they kind of like secretly share the same
Yeah,
structures.
like these hidden blueprints that you wouldn't necessarily notice at first glance.
Right, like the kind of thing where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then you start to get it why certain stories just work. You know what I mean?
Totally. I mean, I think that's what makes this stuff so fascinating, right? It's like beyond the actors and the
Hmm.
special effects and all the flash, there are these like fundamental patterns that keep popping up in these big hit movies.
Exactly. So basically, that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to use all this material you sent to like unpack this whole idea of story structure in movies. Why do they use these templates? What does it even mean?
Right. So let's jump right into it. One of the things your sources call out is this idea of structural identity. It's like this dirty little secret in Hollywood.
Yeah. And I got to say, when I first read this part, I was like, what are they even talking about? But then the examples they give totally click.
Right. Like they're basically saying a lot of movies, when you break them down, are actually kind of the same.
Yeah. And it's not just like similar themes or whatever. They mean like the same sequence of events, the same character arcs.
Yeah. And it's wild when you see the examples they give, like Point Break with Keanu Reeves, that
Yeah.
surfing movie, and
Yeah.
then Fast and the Furious, the one with all the cars. Those are supposed to be the same movie underneath,
Yeah.
just with different, like, window
I
dressing.
know, right? And it's not just those two. They also talk about how The Matrix and Monsters, Inc.
Mhm.
share this like core structure. And that one I don't even see. I mean, how do those two even go together?
Yeah, that's the thing. It really makes you rethink how you see these films.
Yeah.
Oh, and they also mention Who Framed Roger Rabbit
Huh.
and Chinatown.
Yeah.
And then there's Blank Check and Home Alone, all built on surprisingly similar frameworks.
Okay, so this is where I started to wonder, like, is Hollywood just lazy? Are they just rehashing the same ideas over and over? You know?
Right. I mean, it definitely raises the question of originality. But the material you sent actually digs into why this happens.
Yeah. It's not always intentional, right? Sometimes it's just because those templates work, they connect with people. And sometimes it's more like a subconscious thing where storytellers are kind of drawing on those familiar patterns without even realizing it.
Right, like they're tapping into this shared understanding of what makes a good story, what keeps us engaged.
Exactly. And honestly, did anyone walk out of Fast and Furious being like, hey, wait a minute, this is just Point Break on wheels?
Probably not. Because what really grabs this is the surface stuff, the action, the characters we connect with, the specifics of that world.
Right. And the thing is, those deeper story structures, those templates, they're not just about copying. They're like tools to help us understand what makes a story effective.
Exactly. It's like there are these laws of physics, but for storytelling.
Mm.
And once you understand them, it can help you craft a story that actually works.
Oh, yeah. This is the part where things started to get really interesting for me. It's like there's this hidden architecture to stories. And if you
Oh.
know how to use it, you can build something truly captivating.
Right. And the sources you sent, they really emphasize the importance of understanding why these story elements work the way they do, why they fit together.
Like, it's not enough to just copy the structure of a movie you like. You gotta get the underlying mechanics of it. Why does it work? What makes it tick?
Exactly. And then the advice they give is so practical, like don't just steal, don't just copy. But if you are going to use a familiar element, try to twist it, make it your own, put a fresh spin on it.
Yeah, and that's where true originality comes in. It's like you can't break the rules effectively until you actually know what they are.
Right. Until you really understand the fundamentals, you can't push the boundaries.
Now, this brings us to another cool idea that your sources talk about. It's about thinking about genre in a totally different way. They're suggesting that instead of using those traditional categories like comedy or thriller or whatever, maybe we should look at like 10 new categories, categories that define story types based on the actual driving force of the story.
Yeah, and while your excerpts don't actually lay out what those 10 new categories are exactly, the big takeaway for us here is that we should be focusing on what's really pushing the story forward. What's the core conflict? What kind of journey is the main character on?
Exactly. So instead of getting hung up on whether something is a rom-com or a sci-fi or whatever, we should be asking, what's the heart of the story? What are its mechanics?
Right. And they give some pretty interesting examples here to illustrate this point. Like The Breakfast Club. It's not just a coming-of-age story. They classify it as institutionalized, which makes sense, right? You've got these characters stuck in detention, forced to interact with each other.
Right, totally. And then there's Rain Man. It's not just a road trip movie, it's a buddy love story, all about the relationship between these two brothers.
Oh, and they even talk about Zoolander, which they call their favorite bad movie, they categorize that as superhero, maybe because you have this unlikely character thrown into these really absurd situations, but he's still kind of saving the day in his own ridiculous way.
Right. It makes you think about all the different ways to categorize movies, and it's not about fitting neatly into one box or another. It's about understanding the engine that makes the whole thing go.
Exactly. And your sources really hammer this home. This isn't about finding exceptions to genre rules. It's about using genre as a tool, a powerful tool for telling a story in a way that's going to resonate with people.
So for all the aspiring screenwriters out there listening, think about your own story ideas. What's the real genre in this deeper sense of what you're trying to tell? What kind of experience do you want your audience to have?
And remember, a script doesn't have to be limited to just one category. It can pull from different genres. It can even shift as the story unfolds.
Okay, so now let's get into this whole give me the same thing, only different idea. This one's pretty mind-blowing. It's basically the idea that all these genres, all these templates are like echoes of ancient stories, stories that have been told and retold for centuries.
Right. And it's fascinating how your sources trace these modern movie genres back to their mythological roots, like Jaws. It's not just a shark movie. It's like a modern retelling of the Minotaur myth, or all those classic stories about a hero battling a monster.
Totally. And Superman. He's basically Hercules for the modern age. And even something like Road Trip with all its craziness can be seen as an update of the Canterbury Tales. It's all about a journey with a bunch of different characters and all these interconnected stories.
Right. And it all points to this one big idea. Storytelling is about taking these timeless human narratives and making them fresh, making them relevant for today's audiences.
And if you're not aware of that heritage, those older stories that we've been telling each other forever, you're missing out on something essential.
Which leads us perfectly to the next big piece of this puzzle, the who, the hero.
Because once you've got your concept, the what is it of your story, the next big question is, who's the story really about? Who's the audience going to connect with?
Because that character, whether it's a person or even like a mascot or a symbol, that's our way in. That's who we're going to root for or against. That's who we're going to invest our emotions in.
And the examples they give are all over the place. Like you've got Lawrence of Arabia on this epic historical journey, and then you've got a soccer mom in a Tylenol commercial just trying to deal with a headache. But the principle is the same. It's all about finding that central figure that draws us in.
Right. And if you're a screenwriter, your job is to create heroes that don't just connect with the audience. They also need to serve the needs of the story itself. They need to be the right fit for the particular kind of story you're trying to tell.
And it all starts with that log line, that short pitch that captures the essence of the story. And it almost always includes those descriptive adjectives, like a reluctant cop, a brilliant but flawed scientist.
And we can't forget about the bad guy either.
Yeah.
You need those adjectives to define them too. A ruthless corporation, a vengeful spirit, things like that. It gives us a quick snapshot of the forces at play.
Right. And then there's the hero's goal. What are they fighting for? What are they trying to achieve? It needs to be something compelling, something relatable, something that resonates with us on a fundamental human level.
And that brings up another interesting point. Even in movies with huge casts, those ensemble pieces like Pulp Fiction or Crimes and Misdemeanors, you still need a lead character, someone who provides that central focus, someone who often carries the main themes of the film.
Yeah, because even with all those different storylines and characters weaving in and out, you need that one person to ground the whole thing, to provide a through line for the audience to follow.
Now, your sources acknowledge that finding that who, that hero, isn't always the first step in the writing process. Sometimes the idea comes first.
Right. Sometimes it's all about that initial spark of inspiration. But eventually you've got to figure out who's driving this thing, who's at the wheel.
Yeah, and that's where the magic happens, when the right character steps into that leading role.
And the logline examples they give are great. Like for Poker Night, it's henpecked husband finally gets the house to himself for a weekend and ends up losing it all in a poker game to a shady gambler. Boom! Right there, you've got your main character. And the story is all about what happens to him, how he changes.
Or how about this one for third grade? Adult man is forced to go back to elementary school. Pretty basic premise, right? But then they tell you the main character is this super immature businessman who designs violent video games.
Yeah.
And suddenly, the whole thing comes alive. You can already picture the comedy, the awkwardness.
It's like finding the right who for your story can take a so-so idea and turn it into something special.
Yeah, and your sources even talk about how you can amp up your log line by messing around with the characters, make them more complex, give them more interesting motivations.
Right, like take 4 Christmases. A young couple has to visit all 4 of their divorced parents on Christmas Day. Kind of a fun premise, but not super deep. But then you add this layer where they're both terrified of ending up like their parents. Suddenly the stakes are higher. We care more about whether they make it through.
Exactly. It gives the whole story this emotional weight. Or how about Ride Along? Risk-averse teacher tries to impress his girlfriend's overprotective cop brother by going on a ride-along. Right away, you get the dynamic between these two guys, and the underlying goal is to win over the girl.
Oh, and they talk about how if you switch those character descriptions around, the whole movie changes. Like, what if the teacher was an ex-Green Beret and the cop was totally scared of everything? That's a different movie entirely.
Totally.
Yeah.
Or take The Retreat. So it's about this newbie employee who becomes the target of murder attempts during a corporate retreat.
Okay.
Sounds kind of funny, right? But what if the main character was like 65 years old and about to retire?
Right. That changes the whole vibe. The stakes are different. The themes are different. It's not a comedy anymore.
It really shows how much power that who has. So how do you create a hero that actually works? Your sources break it down pretty simply.
Right. First, you want someone who's going to create conflict. They need to be the kind of person who's going to stir things up, who's going to clash with other characters.
Second, they need to have room to grow. They need to go on a journey. They need to change in some way over the course of the story.
And third, they need to be someone the audience wants to root for, someone they can relate to. And this is where that whole demographic thing comes in. You got to know who you're making the movie for.
And your sources talk about how important it is to be aware of your own biases. Like they share a story about trying to pitch a Julio Iglesias movie.
I remember that one. It's like their heart wasn't in it. And then there's that story about the ad exec who thought everyone spent their Sundays playing polo.
It's a good reminder that not everyone sees the world the same way we do.
Exactly. Okay, now let's get to the primal urge. This is a big one.
Because your sources are basically saying that no matter what your hero's goal is on the surface, it needs to be tied to something deeper, something primal.
Right. Like, even if it seems like a simple goal, like getting a promotion at work, it needs to connect to those basic human desires. The need for love, for connection, for survival.
Because those are the things that really grab us. Those are the things that make us lean forward in our seats and say, I need to see what happens next.
Like, life or death stakes are always going to be more compelling than, like, a fight over a parking spot.
Right. And your sources even list out some of those key primal urges. Survival, hunger, sex, protecting loved ones, the fear of death.
And they go back to some of those logline examples to show how it works, like 4 Christmases without the couple being in love, meh. Ride Along without the girlfriend, the stakes are lower. The Retreat without any real danger, boring.
So the lesson here is to always give your hero something real to fight for, something we can all understand and connect with on a gut level.
Now, when it comes to actually casting these heroes, your sources have some pretty strong opinions.
Yeah, they're not big fans of pre-casting, writing a role with a specific actor in mind before you even have funding.
Right, because what if that actor isn't available? Or what if they're not interested? You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
Exactly. Like they tell that story about Chicken Hawk Down, the comedy about the president going after bin Laden. They wrote it with a very specific type of actor in mind, and it made it really hard to get the movie made.
Right. So the advice is to write characters that a lot of different actors could play. Keep your options open.
And then they bring up this whole idea of actor archetypes. It's like Jungian stuff, the idea that we have these deep-seated needs to see certain types of characters play out on screen.
Right. And they even have their own set of archetypes that they call Snyderian.
And they give examples of actors who fit these archetypes, like the young man on the rise archetype. You've got guys like Harold Lloyd, Steve Martin, Adam Sandler, Ashton Kutcher, all different, but they all fit that mold.
Or the good girl tempted archetype. You've got Betty Grable, Doris Day, Meg Ryan, Reese Witherspoon.
And it goes on and on. The imp, the sex goddess, the hunk, the wounded soldier, and so on.
And the point is that these archetypes have these built-in story arcs. Like, we expect them to behave in certain ways. We want to see them go on certain journeys.
So the advice is to write for the archetype, not the star.
Because if you create a great character who fits that archetype, the right actor will come along.
Now, what about those special circumstances?
Yeah.
Biographies, ensembles, animation. What happens to the hero in those situations?
Right, because those are all a bit different. Like with biographies, even if the person you're writing about isn't a saint, you still need to find a way for the audience to connect with them.
Like the example of Kinsey. He was a controversial figure, but the filmmakers found a way to make him relatable.
And The People versus Larry Flint? Same thing. They made him the hero, even though he wasn't exactly a role model.
And then, A Beautiful Mind. They even fudged some facts to make John Nash more sympathetic.
And they even talk about their own experience writing a John DeLorean biography. They had to find a way to make him the hero, even though he was kind of a mess.
Right, and with ensemble movies, the hero often becomes the character who carries the theme.
Like in a lot of Robert Altman movies, the city itself is almost like the main character.
Right, or in Pulp Fiction, you could argue that the briefcase is the hero. Just kidding. But seriously, with ensembles, you got to ask, who's facing the most conflict? Who's growing the most? Who's the most likable?
And then with animation, it's all about adapting existing material, which can be tricky. Like they talk about how they changed Aladdin's character in the Disney movie.
And Mulan, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, they all had to be adapted to fit a certain mold.
But the process is still the same. Find a hero the audience can connect with. Give them a clear goal. Raise the stakes.
And this brings us to the final piece of advice from your sources. Be a slave to your logline.
Yeah, once you've nailed down your hero and their primal goal, you gotta keep going back to that logline. Make sure everything you write stays true to it.
Because the logline is like the DNA of your story. It's the foundation. If you stray too far from it, you risk losing the heart of what made the story work in the first place.
And it's not just for the writer, it's for everyone involved in the project. Producers, actors, even the audience. Everyone needs to be on the same page about what the story's about.
And the best log lines, the ones that really grab you, they have that clear conflict, they have those sharply defined characters, and they have that primal goal. It just hooks you in.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's recap what we've learned. First, those hidden story templates are everywhere. They're like the secret sauce of Hollywood.
Second, genre is more than just a label. It's about the underlying mechanics of the story, what makes it tick.
Third, the hero is everything. Find the right one and your story will sing.
Fourth, those actor archetypes are powerful. They tap into something deep within us.
And fifth, stick to your logline. It's your roadmap to success.
And the biggest takeaway of all, if you want to make a movie that people will love, find a hero they can root for. Someone who's going through something real, something that matters.
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, connecting with the audience on a human level.
And here's a final thought for you. Think about your favorite movie, the one that really stayed with you. Now try to break it down. What's the template? Who's the hero? What's their primal urge?
You might be surprised by what you discover.
And it might just make you appreciate that movie even more.
So until next time, keep diving.
Keep exploring.
And keep those amazing sources coming.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Bye for now.
So long.